Millie Vincent's Court of Public Opinion by Mindy McGinnis. I didn't commit adultery until I was 57 years old. I'd call that an illustration of fortitude rather than an example of weakness. Others would disagree, I know, which is how I ended up in Millie Vincent's bedroom, waiting for her to die. An outsider would think she's the most loved person in the community by the cars in the drive, the number of covered dishes in the fridge. These things are a testament to emotion, for sure. But it ain't love. It's fear. Millie Vincent, as my friend Carl Powers says, is the nastiest mean old bitch that ever walked the earth. That's how I know that Carl is a good man. He's the only person that says a sideways word about Millie Vincent, which means she's got nothing on him. How Millie learned about me stepping out, I can't say, but she didn't waste time making it clear she knew. I was walking my dog, an ancient dachshund named Sally that had more weight on her than my wife. Sally had gotten so fat in her old age that when she did her little trick of sitting up, all her weight shifted to her rear and she was stuck there, like a paperweight, until either me or Gertie tipped her on over. Gertie said she found Sally once stuck on the front porch, sitting up, little front paws hanging limply on her chest, panting like hell in the late summer Iowa heat. Gertie gave her a nudge, and when the dog got her feet under her, she made a dash for the water like it was the Dust Bowl all over again. And I guess maybe to her it was, though she can't remember them days. I had Sally on her leash, little legs doing their best to move along everything above them, when Millie Vincent waved me down from her porch. I felt my stomach bottom out, drop right there onto the part of the sidewalk that the PWA never got around to fixin'. Millie don't talk to you unless she heard something bad with your name attached. I already knew what it was, hanging over me the same way Sally's folds of fat did that crumbly bit of sidewalk. Janine Turner had my eye back in grade school, but I hadn't seen her much in the 40 years in between, other than to give a nod in the street until she took a job at the hardware store. One off-color joke about buying screws from her that made her bat her eyelashes, and pretty soon I'm wondering if she still has that mole I remember right above her knee. Not a big one, just kind of nice and brown, and if you let your imagination work, you could think it was shaped like an arrow pointing you to greener pastures. So I say something about that, and she shows me the mole and makes a comment about how that little arrow could point towards that dingy hotel down by the interstate if I were so inclined. And I guess I was. Enough to drive over there later on to see if she was just pulling my leg. Enough to go on over to her car to see how far she was going to take this. Or how far I was. There's two kinds of news in this town, the kind that makes it into the paper that you can talk about over dinner, and the unofficial kind that holds more truth, carries more weight, and affects people's lives more than anything in ink. It's voices the news travels on here, not paper. And Millie Vincent hears them all from her rocking chair. So when she called to me from it, I knew I'd put my foot in it. Or your prick in it, Carl said to me when I got drunk enough at the reservoir to both come clean and dirty myself at the same time. You've been married to Gertie forever, Dave. Why all of a sudden you get to thinking something else looked good? I stared down into what was left in my beer, thinking about Gertie and Sally, waiting for me at home, one of them stick-thin and one pot-bellied, both of them dear to me. At our age, nothing looks good, I told him. It's just a different type of bad. It's true. Janine Turner and I might have been acting like kids in that hotel room, but neither one of us took our clothes off until the lights was out. After all that thinking I'd done about her mole, I don't think I actually saw it except for that first flash at the hardware store. You in it now, Carl had said. You remember Jefferson Tully? Yeah, I remembered him. He'd been in my thoughts a lot lately, more than Janine or even Gertie. Jefferson was a god of sorts back when we was kids. All-around athlete, always had a joke. Some he could tell in front of your parents, most he couldn't. He could get his hands on a drink even during Prohibition, and you weren't nobody going to complain about it anyway, not when our football team was going to regionals for the first time in a faded memory. His girl, Julie, was the preacher's daughter, had hair the color of corn at harvest, and Jefferson said it was like that everywhere on her. I was young enough to think he shouldn't say such things, but old enough to be interested. Later, when Julie's middle started to grow and her eyes puffed up right alongside her stomach, I put two and two together. Thing I couldn't understand was how her belly flattened out a few weeks later, as did Jefferson Tully's mouth. He didn't smile no more, and the jokes had stopped. If there was talk then, I was too little to hear it, but one thing I did see was Millie Vincent watching the both of them, the first threads of gray in her spinster head just starting to show. Jefferson had always been the kind to laugh loud, but with that came something darker, a touch of temper I'd heard tales of. Maybe some of the more stubborn cows on the Tully farm had marks on their hindquarters, and maybe Jefferson's dog seemed a little too quick to obey sometimes, like it was fear moving him, not love. That thread of dark running in Jefferson lashed out at Millie one day after church when she looked a little too long over her shoulder back at the Tully pew. He took her by the elbow like he was being a helpful young man at the church steps, and then gave her what for as he walked her to her car. He did it real quiet, and his voice didn't carry, but his face looked like them fiery angels Preacher Willis talked about that day, and I felt real sorry for the Tully dog right then. And Millie Vincent, which was foolish. She sucked her teeth at him and drove off, leaving him in a cloud of dirt that settled on his shoulders, just like the talk would soon enough. The talk that Millie Vincent wasn't afraid to make. Other people kept their hands over their mouths when they said the things the paper didn't print. They whispered, and they used words that didn't mean quite the same thing as what they were actually saying. Interfered with instead of rape. Light-fingered instead of thief. Millie Vincent didn't do those things. She pretended to be hard of hearing and acted like her listener was too. She said the real words, the damning ones, and she said them loudly. Or she would if you didn't do right by her. Jefferson Tully had too much pride to do that, so instead, he jumped off the trestle bridge outside of town. That did make the paper. I had a feeder calf I was pumping up for the county fair that year, but one bag of oats had gone bad. It was sitting in the corner of the barn, smelling up a stall, and I got it in my head to see what would happen if it went the same way Jefferson did. It was a good bit lighter than he would have been, but still heavy as guilt when me and Carl dragged it up to the spot where Jefferson went over. We counted as it fell, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, and then watched as 100 pounds of spoiled oats sprayed over the valley floor like he had. It wasn't pretty, and a whole flock of swallows came up dead later that fall. I didn't know if that was my fault or not, but I felt bad about it. Bad enough to still let it bother me now. More than the business with Janine, if I'm being honest. All of that brought me here to Millie's bedside, waiting for her to take her last breath in a room that's full of the exhales of sinners. Judge Cooper is here, no doubt because of miscounted ballots. The commissioner's sitting across from me, but all I can see is the new fence around his pasture that popped up right when some of the county funds disappeared. There's others I can guess at. Nice housewives and dutiful husbands. A couple of old-timers whose secrets are so ancient they wouldn't cause much dust anymore. But I guess they still don't want it out there for other people to chew on. Some young folks are hanging about, too. The Clifford boy, who's been mowing Millie's yard for the past 3 years, and Rose Parker, who's been carrying a tray of lemonade to Millie's rocking chair for about a month. It's awful quiet in here for a house so full of bodies. Everyone's still in their own voices so they can hear if Millie starts talking, pointing fingers and making announcements. Her eyelids flutter a little, the skin so wrinkled and full it's probably like trying to lift sandbags. But she manages, opens her eyes to see all of us gathered there, and she smiles. It's a nice smile, one I don't think I've ever seen. It certainly wasn't on her face when she called me to her porch that day and said, "I know something about you, Davy Miles." That's all it took. I repainted her house and have been slowly replacing the windows. There's a few left on the west side, the only ones that still have wavy old glass that distorts everything you see through it. Millie takes a rough breath that comes with a rattle, and I think maybe those windows will be staying. "You all," she says, and we lean in at once, cloudy eyes passing over her congregation as she nods, all accounted for. "I never knew nothing," she says, eyes falling closed again. "I watch and I listen, but I never knew nothing until the day you couldn't look me in the face. I had you then, without having to say much at all. Sometimes I had a guess. More often I didn't have the faintest. I don't lift a finger, but I live well, because you can't have your deeds said to your faces." Millie Vincent died then, unremarkably. She simply stopped breathing, like any other person would. We left, one by one, some taking their covered dishes back home with them, some not. We left an immaculate house built upon sin and kept clean by guilt. We went home with nothing left to fear but ourselves.